A fierce winter storm blankets the small mountain town of Frosthaven Ridge, snow whipping through the air and covering every street in white. Amid the chaos, a tiny white German shepherd pup struggles alone, trembling and blind, fighting for each breath. Will she survive the storm? Will someone hear her desperate cries? Today, you will witness a story of courage, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a human and a pup who refuses to give up. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts as we follow her journey. Frosthaven Ridge, a small mountain town in Colorado, lay buried under a thick blanket of freshly fallen snow. The streets were deserted, the street lamps casting pale golden halos through the swirling flakes. A sharp wind cut through the trees, rattling branches and sending icy shards against the windows of the few houses still showing signs of life. It was the kind of winter day that made the world feel suspended, hushed, and cruelly indifferent to those who struggled within it. Officer Ethan Calloway, 38 years old, broad-shouldered, with deep-set green eyes that carried both weariness and determination, drove slowly along the icy road in his patrol SUV. His brown hair peeked out from under his woolen hat, and a faint scar along his left cheek hinted at past confrontations, a silent witness to years of service in the rugged mountain towns. Ethan was methodical and disciplined, the kind of man whose quiet strength and moral code had saved lives before, yet his past was also a gallery of regrets and unspoken losses. The failed adoption of a shelter pup years ago, a lonely divorce that still throbbed in his chest, moments he could never forget. He had long ago learned to carry the weight of others' suffering without showing it, yet today something felt different, sharper, urgent. Through the thick veil of falling snow, a small, fragile sound reached him, almost swallowed by the howl of the wind. A faint whimper, uneven and trembling, yet impossibly persistent. Ethan's heart clenched. He turned the SUV toward the sound, sliding cautiously on the slick road. Beneath a snow-draped pine, he spotted it. A tiny German shepherd pup, its coat almost pure white, matted with ice and dirt, its body curled tightly against the snow. She could have been invisible, and yet she was there, defying the cold with her desperate, shivering form. Ethan's breath hitched. The pup was barely 2 months old, impossibly small, ribs visible through her thin fur, her limbs trembling uncontrollably. What made him pause even more were her eyes, milky white, unfocused, reflecting the storm as if she were peering into emptiness. She could not see. The pup was blind, abandoned, and already fighting for the tiniest scrap of survival. Ethan slid out of his SUV, boots crunching in the fresh snow. The wind tugged at his coat, but he ignored it, kneeling carefully beside her. "Hey, hey, little one," he whispered, his breath misting in the frigid air. The pup's ears twitched faintly and a shiver ran through her small frame. Ethan's gloved hands hovered for a heartbeat before he scooped her up, careful to avoid any sudden pressure. She was fragile, like glass wrapped in frost, and every ounce of his being feared breaking what was left of her battered body. He pressed her against his chest, feeling the rapid thump of her tiny heart, shallow and uneven, but alive. He murmured continuously, a quiet promise. "I've got you now. You're safe. You'll see the sunrise again." The pup whimpered, pressing into the warmth of his coat as if she recognized, in some inexplicable way, that he was the only thing standing between her and the icy nothing outside. The town was eerily silent except for the gusts of wind and the distant scrape of snowplows. Ethan's mind raced, considering every possible obstacle, the treacherous road, the icy hills, the long stretch to the Frosthaven Animal Clinic. He knew waiting for anyone else for backup might be fatal. Time was a predator, and this pup's body was too fragile to withstand even minutes of hesitation. Sliding open the SUV door, he placed Zephyr, he had named her immediately after the wind that seemed to carry her cries, on his lap, wrapping her in the extra layer of his jacket. Every movement was cautious. A single misstep could bruise bones that had already borne the weight of cruelty. The ride to the clinic was a blur. Ethan gripped the steering wheel with one hand, holding Zephyr with the other, eyes darting from icy patches to the taillights ahead. She whimpered against him, tiny sounds that cut deeper than any word, carrying the raw weight of fear and pain. The city outside the mountains seemed oblivious, cars passing by without noticing the fragile life in his arms. A cab braked sharply beside him as they reached the highway. Its driver, mid-40s, broad-shouldered with a lined, weathered face, peered in shock. Ethan waved frantically, explaining the urgency. Without hesitation, the driver pulled over and opened the door. "Get her in," Ethan gasped. Inside the clinic, the sterile air contrasted starkly with the raw chaos outside. Dr. Julian Harper, a 46-year-old veterinarian with a calm, authoritative presence, stepped forward immediately. His dark hair streaked with silver, eyes sharp and assessing, carried the weight of decades caring for animals whose lives teetered on fragile threads. "Bring her here," he instructed as Ethan laid Zephyr on the examination table, still swaddled in his jacket. The pup let out a small, broken whimper, pressing against Ethan's fingers. Dr. Harper examined Zephyr quickly, lifting her tiny limbs, pressing along her fragile spine and ribs. "Multiple fractures, severe trauma, and she's blind. Likely nerve damage," he said, his voice low but firm. Each word was a hammer to Ethan's chest, but he did not flinch, instead whispering encouragements, stroking her small head, conveying warmth and safety. Zephyr responded subtly, shifting closer to him, trusting the rhythm of his voice even without the gift of sight. Despite the grim prognosis, Ethan's resolve hardened. He would not leave her side. Every soft whimper, every tremor, every desperate breath reinforced his determination. The storm outside, the icy roads, the indifference of the world, all of it melted away in the heat of his focus. Zephyr was alive, and he would do everything to ensure she stayed that way. The vet began preparations for stabilization, wrapping fractures carefully and setting up IV lines, but Ethan's hands never left her, his voice a tether to life and hope. Through the long, tense minutes, the room filled with the symphony of beeps, soft whimpers, and shuffling movements. Zephyr, fragile and battered, clung to Ethan's presence as if it were the only truth in a suddenly hostile universe. Outside, the wind howled against the clinic windows, but inside a bond was forming, one forged not by sight, but by trust, warmth, and the raw instinct to survive. By the time Ethan allowed a brief step back, Zephyr rested quietly, still wrapped in his jacket. Though tiny, frail, and permanently blind, she was alive, and the fight for her life had only just begun. The first chapter of her journey through storm, neglect, and the brink of death had opened a winter tale of survival and the fragile but unyielding spark of hope. The clinic's fluorescent lights were harsh, sterile, and unyielding compared to the swirling snow outside, yet they offered a fragile sanctuary from the storm. Ethan Calloway, still clutching Zephyr to his chest, felt the weight of responsibility press into his shoulders, heavier than any patrol duty or call for backup. Zephyr's small body quivered, not from the chill now, but from pain and shock. Her chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths, and Ethan could feel every tiny bone through the thin fur, each tremor a testament to the trauma she had endured. Dr. Julian Harper, the veterinarian, moved with efficient precision. Tall, lean, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a voice calm yet authoritative, he had spent decades treating animals in life-or-death situations. He knelt beside Zephyr, gently lifting a leg to check for fractures. The pup screamed in a small, piercing cry that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Multiple fractures, possible internal injuries and nerve damage," Dr. Harper muttered. "And she's blind. I can't tell if it's permanent yet, but likely." Ethan pressed Zephyr closer, whispering, "I've got you. You'll see another sunrise, I promise." Even in the warm clinic, the winter storm seemed to follow them, howling through cracks in the old building. Ethan's mind raced, calculating every risk. Zephyr's tiny body needed warmth, nutrition, and immediate stabilization. Hesitation could mean her last breath. He moved to help, assisting Dr. Harper in placing IV lines, wrapping her fractured limbs with gentle, deliberate hands. Every movement was careful, precise, the way one might handle a fragile artifact, because one wrong shift could crush what little was left intact. As the minutes passed, Zephyr's faint whimpers became her constant language, a mix of fear, pain, and a yearning to survive. Ethan spoke softly, recounting his own life in fragments, stories of the shepherd dog he had as a child, a dog that had once been his only companion through lonely winters. He murmured anecdotes not to entertain Zephyr, but to weave a thread of human warmth around her trembling form. She shifted slightly, pressing against his chest as if she could understand the reassurance in his voice. Dr. Harper worked quickly, assessing each injury with careful hands, his experience guiding every decision. "She'll need constant monitoring," he said, adjusting the fluids and medications. "She may not take food willingly. If she doesn't eat, we lose her." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He had already decided he would be there every step, every hour, to ensure she did not face the world alone. The first attempts at feeding were difficult. Zephyr, tiny and exhausted, turned away from the formula Ethan offered on a small spoon. Her lips quivered in resistance, a small gesture of stubborn survival rather than defiance. He tried again, whispering, "Just a taste. You can do it. I'm here." Slowly, with infinite patience, she licked a droplet, then another, her small tongue barely making contact. It was nothing more than a whisper of nutrition, but it was enough. Her first act of trust in a human being marked a small victory against the immense odds. Night fell outside, turning the storm into a black curtain punctuated by the occasional flash of streetlights through drifting snow. Inside the clinic, Ethan did not leave her side. He rested on a chair, eyes fixed on Zephyr's chest, rising and falling, noting every slight twitch, every shiver. Her whimpers were still present, but softened slightly, becoming a rhythm he recognized. He murmured constantly, telling her she was not alone, that her pain had not gone unnoticed, that she had been chosen for life and would not be abandoned again. In the quiet moments, when nurses moved silently to check vital signs or adjust bandages, Ethan reflected on the sheer fragility of this tiny life. Zephyr's body was smaller than a loaf of bread, yet it contained a will to survive that was astonishing. Each tiny heartbeat was a declaration, each whimper a question. "Will you fight for me?" And Ethan answered without hesitation, "Yes. Every breath of yours is worth everything." The night stretched interminably. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, rattling windows and piling snow against the clinic doors. Ethan remained vigilant, adjusting blankets, keeping Zephyr warm, and whispering incessantly, each word a balm against fear and the cold. The pup's trust was delicate. Any abrupt sound or movement might frighten her back into the instinctive panic of abandonment. Every gentle touch was a lesson. Not all hands break, some heal. Not all voices vanish, some guide. By morning, the first feeble light of winter filtered through the frosted windows. Zephyr's body was still fragile, her limbs stiff from trauma, but she had taken more sips of formula, her trust growing incrementally. Ethan encouraged her to shift, helping her tiny legs beneath her to attempt a tentative stand. She wobbled violently, her body betraying her with every tremor, and collapsed onto the blanket with a soft whimper. Yet she did not give up. He whispered encouragements, step by step. "You are stronger than you think," and gently steadied her, letting her feel the support but not carrying her completely. Each failed step was still a victory. She was asserting her will over her own limitations. Nurses entered quietly, observing the tentative movements of the tiny pup with awe. One whispered, "She's stronger than she looks." Ethan's throat tightened. He nodded, pressing closer, knowing that strength was not only in bones but in courage, in the tiny defiance of life refusing to surrender. Zephyr, though blind and battered, was beginning to learn that the world held more than danger. It held warmth, patience, and trust. By the second day, small gestures became milestones. Zephyr would follow Ethan's voice, lift her head at the sound of his boots, and nudge toward his hand. Each act of recognition was a map she was creating in her own mind, using sound, scent, and instinct. Ethan noted every twitch of her ears, every shift of her paws. Every gesture was proof that survival was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, and that even a life shattered by cruelty could find hope again. As Chapter 2 drew to a close, Zephyr lay swaddled in blankets, her small chest rising and falling steadily. She had begun to eat more willingly, to respond to Ethan's voice with curiosity rather than terror, and to shift her gazeless eyes toward the sounds that marked her safe world. The storm outside still raged, but within the clinic, warmth, patience, and unwavering vigilance were beginning to knit a fragile thread of life back together. Zephyr's battle for survival was far from over, but the first steps, literal and metaphorical, had been taken. The winter storm outside remained unforgiving, but inside, a bond had formed, and a tiny spark of hope had begun to burn. The early morning light barely pierced the frosted windows of Frosthaven Animal Clinic, painting thin, pale streaks across the sterile room. The winter storm outside had not yet abated, snow swirling violently in the streets like restless spirits, but inside, a tense quiet hung over the small examination area. Ethan Calloway crouched beside Zephyr, the tiny German shepherd pup wrapped in layers of soft blankets in his jacket. The pup, just 2 months old, was still trembling, her body a fragile lattice of fractures and bruises, yet her chest rose with a determined rhythm, a stubborn declaration that she had not yet surrendered to the darkness. Dr. Julian Harper moved quickly but carefully, his tall, lean frame taut with focus. His storm-gray eyes darted over every inch of Zephyr's frail body, lifting tiny limbs, pressing along ribs and spine, listening for the smallest signs of internal injury. Ethan watched, hands hovering, ready to offer warmth or steady her, but mindful not to obstruct the delicate procedure. Zephyr let out faint, broken whimpers, each one tugging at the fabric of Ethan's chest, piercing deeper than any winter wind could. "She's fighting," Harper murmured, almost to himself, "but she's barely holding on." Ethan's voice was a soft tether. "You're not alone. You're stronger than you think. I'm right here." Zephyr twitched slightly, pressing against his chest. Her blind eyes, milky and unfocused, reflected only the faint light of the clinic, but her trust in his presence was palpable. Every subtle shift of her tiny head, every flex of her paws, seemed to affirm that she understood, if not the words, then the intention behind them. Feeding Zephyr was an ordeal. Her tiny body refused the spoonfuls of formula Ethan offered. She twisted away, shivering violently, the trauma of abandonment and the pain of broken bones making each swallow a monumental task. Ethan persisted patiently, dipping his finger into the formula and letting the tiniest droplet brush her lips. Slowly Zephyr licked, hesitated, then took another and another. It was a whisper of sustenance, but enough to coax a fragile spark of life to grow stronger. Ethan whispered softly, recounting stories of his childhood shepherd dog, of winter nights and quiet companionship, trying to knit a blanket of safety and trust around her fragile spirit. Hours passed in a blur of movement and stillness. Nurses glided quietly through the room, checking monitors, adjusting blankets, offering brief, encouraging smiles. But it was Ethan who remained the anchor. His eyes never left Zephyr. When she whimpered, he leaned closer. When she shivered, he applied warmth. Every sigh, every twitch, was a small victory in the battle against despair. Outside, the storm raged, painting the world in stark whites and grays. Yet inside, warmth, patience, and human presence wove a fragile cocoon of hope. The pup's first attempts to move were tentative. Ethan helped guide her tiny legs beneath her, encouraging each wobbling stand. Zephyr's paws trembled violently. Her body buckled, forcing her to collapse back onto the blanket with a soft whimper. Yet, she did not give up. Step by step, guided by Ethan's voice and gentle hands, she managed to hold herself upright for fleeting moments. Each small attempt was celebrated quietly by Ethan, who whispered reassurances like sacred incantations. "Step by step. You are stronger than you think. You can do this." Dr. Harper kept a careful watch, noting every movement and reaction. "She's incredibly weak," he said, brushing a hand across Zephyr's fragile fur, "but she's resilient. We might stabilize her bones and trauma, but her spirit is already fighting in ways medicine can't teach." Ethan nodded, pressing his face into the pup's neck, breathing in her faint, cold scent, and feeling an extraordinary bond forming. This tiny life, almost invisible and abandoned, was shaping the contours of his own humanity, pulling him into a shared struggle that neither would forget. By midday, the storm outside had eased slightly, but inside the clinic, the tension remained. Zephyr's limbs were still bandaged, her body was bruised, her fur matted with remnants of ice and snow, yet she began to respond more consistently to Ethan's presence. When he whispered, she would lift her head, sniff the air, press closer to him. She followed his hands, nudged toward his feet, letting the warmth of human touch and voice guide her actions. Every soft lick of her tiny tongue on the droplet of formula was a statement. She would survive, and she would trust again. Night approached slowly. Frost covered the windows, the final remnants of the storm reflecting the dim lights within. Ethan, exhausted but unwavering, remained beside her. keeping her warm and repeating soft phrases of encouragement. Zephyr's whimpers softened to occasional, almost questioning murmurs, a small dialogue between two souls, one human, one canine, bound by shared vulnerability. In one quiet moment, Ethan let his hand rest lightly on her head, feeling the subtle twitch of her ears, the rhythm of her breath. The connection was electric, fragile, but undeniable. He could feel the pup mapping her tiny world through sound, scent, and instinct, learning to navigate not with sight, but with the language of trust. Every tilt of her head, every tiny paw movement, was a revelation, a declaration that life, even in its smallest form, held meaning beyond pain. As the chapter drew to a close, Zephyr lay swaddled in warmth, her chest rising slowly and steadily. Her first tentative steps had been taken. Her first tastes of nourishment had been coaxed. She was not out of danger, far from it, but a bond had formed that could withstand the cruelty of the world outside. The winter storm still pressed against the clinic walls, relentless and unforgiving, yet inside, a fragile sanctuary of life, patience, and hope had been carved. Zephyr's fight had only just begun, but the first crucial milestones, the decision to survive, the willingness to trust, the acceptance of care, had been claimed. And as Ethan whispered once more, promising another sunrise, another chance at life, the small pup pressed closer, answering in her own way, the quiet, unyielding heartbeat of a will determined to live. The morning light crept hesitantly through the frost-laden windows of Frost Haven Animal Clinic, scattering pale beams across the clinical floor. Outside, the storm had softened to a persistent snowfall, flakes drifting lazily down from a gray, endless sky, carpeting the mountain town in silver. Inside, the small room still hummed with the soft beeps of monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses attending to other patients. But all Ethan Calloway's focus was on Zephyr. The tiny German shepherd pup lay swaddled in layers of blankets in his jacket, her frail body slowly warming under his careful watch. Her breathing, once shallow and desperate, now carried a faint rhythm, punctuated occasionally by tentative whimpers. Ethan, 38, rugged and tall with green eyes that carried the fatigue of countless winters, had scarcely left her side since rescuing her. His uniform was dusted with snow from the storm outside, sleeves damp and gloves stiff with cold, yet he remained kneeling beside Zephyr, speaking softly, murmuring a constant thread of reassurance. Step by step, you're safe. I'm right here. His voice, steady and warm, was a lifeline in her silent, blind world. Dr. Julian Harper, 46, experienced and meticulous, had completed initial stabilization. He leaned over Zephyr, observing her responses, checking the IV, adjusting the tiny bandages around her fractured legs. Her fractures are set, but she's still extremely weak. Any sudden movement could harm her. She's making tiny attempts to respond now, but progress will be slow. He straightened, his eyes meeting Ethan's. There was respect there, tempered with caution. Even the veteran vet understood the fragility of this pup's spirit. Zephyr's first movements were cautious. Ethan gently positioned her tiny paws beneath her, guiding her to stand. She wobbled violently, legs trembling under her own weight, body threatening to collapse. Each collapse was accompanied by a soft, quivering whimper that seemed to echo across the room. Ethan leaned closer, whispering encouragement. You can do it. You're stronger than you know. Slowly, Zephyr shifted her weight forward, one paw, then another, teetering uncertainly but refusing to surrender to the floor. The tiniest spark of movement, the subtle attempt at balance, felt monumental, a declaration of life against overwhelming odds. Over the next hours, Ethan created a structured world for Zephyr within the clinic room. Every sound, every movement was intentional. He would snap his fingers gently across the floor, jingle keys, and hum softly, allowing Zephyr to orient herself through the vibrations and echoes. Each response, each careful turn of her head toward the noise, was a signal that trust was being built. For a blind pup, sound became the compass, Ethan's presence the unwavering north. Meals continued to be a delicate process. Zephyr, still hesitant, was coaxed into taking small bites from Ethan's fingers. Initially, she would turn away, shivering in both pain and fear, but over repeated gentle attempts, she licked and nibbled with increasing confidence. Each swallow was a victory, not just nutritionally but emotionally, a fragile bridge being formed between human and animal. Ethan whispered, telling her stories of his childhood shepherd dog, of quiet nights by the fireplace, and the comforting rhythm of shared steps in the snow. Though she could not see, Zephyr began to understand that warmth and presence could exist without cruelty, that some hands healed rather than harmed. By midday, small milestones accumulated. Zephyr began to lift her head at Ethan's footsteps, tilt it toward the soft jingling of keys, even shift her weight slightly in the direction of his voice. Each micro-movement was a triumph against instinctual fear, a declaration that her spirit, though battered, had not surrendered. Ethan observed intently, noting the subtle twitches of her ears, the slight shifts of her paws, the tiniest whimpers that had morphed from cries of panic to inquiries of trust. Dr. Harper, hovering nearby, nodded with quiet approval. "She's beginning to form associations. You've created a safe anchor for her. She's mapping her world through you." Ethan felt a warmth surge in his chest, a mixture of relief, hope, and something deeper, the recognition that life, even in its most fragile form, could teach resilience. The afternoon stretched slowly. Snow continued to fall outside, but within the clinic, time took on a different texture. Ethan coaxed Zephyr into gentle movements, guiding her to shift across the blanket, teaching her the boundaries of her immediate world. Each stumble was met with calm support rather than rescue, allowing her to learn balance and confidence. Her tiny tail, barely visible through the layers of fur and blankets, twitched faintly, the first visible sign of joy since the storm had begun. Evening approached, and the room settled into a rhythm of quiet care. Ethan remained at her side, sometimes speaking softly, sometimes silent, but always present. He noticed subtle changes, a longer stretch of upright posture, the slight inclination of her head toward his voice, the almost imperceptible nudge of her nose against his hand. Trust, once absent, was growing in tiny increments, like fragile shoots pushing through snow-laden soil. Nurses checked in periodically, whispering reassurances and adjusting monitors. One paused, observing Zephyr's tentative movements. "She's remarkable," she said softly. "Given everything, she's responding. She's learning to navigate." Ethan nodded, pressing closer to her. Each tiny movement was a reminder of the vast gulf she had crossed, from abandonment and fear to tentative exploration and trust. By nightfall, Zephyr lay curled against Ethan, the blankets wrapped snugly around her frail frame. Her breathing was steadier, and her occasional whimpers now carried a softer, questioning tone rather than panic. Ethan felt her relax against his chest, a small but significant acknowledgement that she was beginning to rely on him, not just for survival, but for guidance through a world that had once been incomprehensible and cruel. Outside, the wind continued its relentless passage, but inside, warmth, vigilance, and quiet perseverance had begun to transform the room into a sanctuary. Ethan could see the first sparks of Zephyr's resilience, the beginnings of a map she would rely on to explore her surroundings. The bond they had forged, born from crisis, nurtured by patience, had begun to solidify, laying the foundation for the trials and triumphs still to come. As Chapter 4 drew to a close, Zephyr's tiny body rested quietly, head lifted slightly, ears twitching at the faintest sound of Ethan's movements. The storm outside remained, indifferent and unyielding, yet inside, trust had been cultivated, hope nurtured, and a fragile but unmistakable determination had begun to grow. Zephyr had taken her first steps toward believing in life again, guided by the steadfast presence of a human who refused to let her go. The path ahead would be arduous, but the first signals of trust had been sent and received, marking the continuation of a journey that neither she nor Ethan could yet imagine in its fullness. Winter's grip on Frosthaven Ridge was relentless, but inside the clinic, a fragile warmth radiated from the bond between Ethan Calloway and Zephyr. The snow outside continued to drift in endless sheets, thick and sparkling under the dim morning light, but inside, a tiny universe was forming, one measured in trust, sound, and scent. Zephyr, now beginning her second week in the clinic, was still a small, trembling bundle of white fur, her body bruised and fragile, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. The violent tremors of her early days had softened into cautious, deliberate movements. Every step, Every tilt of her head toward Ethan's voice was an exercise in courage. Ethan, broad-shouldered, green-eyed, and ruggedly handsome, had grown accustomed to the constant weight of responsibility that Zephyr demanded. He had spent countless hours whispering stories, humming soft melodies, and gently guiding her movements. The lessons of patience and vigilance had become second nature. "You can do this, little one," he murmured, his breath warm against her fur, one step at a time. Zephyr pressed against him, her head tilting in recognition, ears flicking at the familiar cadence of his words. This morning, Ethan decided it was time for Zephyr to encounter a world beyond the confines of her blanket. He had cleared a small area in the clinic's back room, placing padded mats along the floor to soften the inevitable stumbles. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, yet through the scent of disinfectant, Zephyr could detect the warmth and presence of Ethan. The pup hesitated at first, tail tucked and ears flattened. Her blind eyes, milky white and unseeing, scanned the space in tiny movements, registering nothing visually, only through vibration, scent, and the steady reassurance of Ethan's voice. "Step forward." "Yes, just a little," Ethan encouraged, placing a gentle hand beneath her belly to help her shift weight without taking over. Zephyr's tiny legs wobbled violently, her paws sliding slightly on the mats, but she did not collapse entirely. Each micro-step was monumental, a quiet victory over fear and physical weakness. Ethan whispered her name repeatedly, creating a constant auditory anchor. "Zephyr, follow me. You're safe here." The repetition became a rhythm, a compass guiding her blind steps. Over the next hours, the exercises continued. Ethan taught Zephyr to orient herself to sound, his footsteps across the padded floor, the jingling of his keys, the soft scrape of his hand along the mats. Each cue was met with gradual recognition. The once frantic, terrified pup began to respond with tentative confidence. She would nudge forward, sniffing the air, tilting her head toward familiar vibrations. Every successful interaction reinforced trust, and with it, a sense of autonomy. For a blind dog, sound and scent became the language of survival, and Zephyr was learning fluently. Meals, too, had become more manageable. Ethan continued to feed her by hand, but Zephyr began to anticipate the spoon, turning toward it with a faint nudge and tentative licks. Every swallow was a small triumph, not merely a physiological need being met, but an affirmation of her growing courage and trust. Ethan celebrated quietly, brushing the soft fur of her head, murmuring stories of snowy nights and the loyal shepherd dog of his childhood. Though she could not see, Zephyr responded subtly, the tilt of her head, a flick of her ears, an almost imperceptible wag of her tail, a silent dialogue of trust and recognition. By midday, Ethan decided to introduce Zephyr to other beings within her limited world, the clinic's resident therapy dogs. 2 medium-sized German shepherds, older and calm, were brought in. Haven, a 7-year-old black and tan shepherd, exuded patience and quiet authority. Willow, a 3-year-old sable, smaller and sprightly, carried a playful energy tempered by wisdom. Both dogs had been socialized to interact carefully with fragile patients. Zephyr, initially cautious, pressed herself against Ethan, tail tucked, ears flat. The other dogs approached slowly, noses low, sniffing the unfamiliar pup and the scent of her human companion. Ethan whispered constant reassurances, positioning Zephyr so that she could feel the presence of the others without being overwhelmed. The first nudge of Haven's nose was met with a startled whimper, but Ethan's steady hands and voice prevented retreat into panic. Gradually, Zephyr began to relax, responding to gentle nudges with tentative presses of her own, her tiny paws brushing against the mats. Willow's playful taps were softer, guided and controlled, and Zephyr's first attempts at gentle interaction were met with encouragement rather than fear. In this carefully controlled introduction, she learned to negotiate space, to anticipate movement, and to understand that other creatures could be safe allies rather than threats. The afternoon stretched into a quiet rhythm of exploration. Ethan observed her closely, guiding when necessary, but allowing Zephyr to make choices, to stumble and recover on her own. Each stumble and recovery taught her balance and spatial awareness, while the gentle companionship of Haven and Willow provided a model of interaction and trust. Zephyr's tail twitched ever so slightly at intervals, her ears flicking toward Ethan's voice, and for the first time in days, she made soft, playful vocalizations, tiny, tentative barks that carried the beginnings of confidence. As evening approached, Ethan allowed Zephyr to rest, swaddled in blankets on a cushioned mat, while he recorded observations for Dr. Harper. He noted her progress, small yet significant. Response to auditory cues, tentative interaction with other dogs, willingness to take food, and subtle signs of emotional recognition and trust. The storm outside had softened to a gentle fall, flakes drifting lazily, but the true storm, the one of fear, trauma, and physical fragility, had begun to abate within Zephyr. Before leaving for the night, Ethan whispered softly into her fur, stroking her head gently. "You've learned so much today. You're finding your world, one sound, one step at a time. Tomorrow we'll go further." Zephyr nuzzled his palm in response, a quiet acknowledgement of connection and faith in the guide who had rescued her from death. Though blind and battered, her spirit was beginning to explore a world previously denied to her, mapping it not with eyes but with trust, sound, and scent. Chapter 5 closed on this fragile yet profound scene. Zephyr resting quietly, ears flicking at the soft sounds of the clinic, tail faintly twitching, chest rising steadily. Ethan remained at her side, a constant presence and anchor in a world that had once been unforgiving. The path forward would demand courage, patience, and resilience, but the first critical steps toward independence, exploration, and emotional recovery had been claimed. Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent and relentless. But inside, Zephyr's world had begun to expand, guided by trust and love. Winter sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees surrounding Ethan Calloway's small backyard in Frosthaven Ridge. The snow, thick and sparkling, reflected the soft gold of the early morning, turning the world into a shimmering winter wonderland. After weeks of careful care, guided exploration, and unwavering patience, Zephyr, the tiny German Shepherd pup, was about to experience a world she had never truly seen, though in her case, seeing would mean feeling, hearing, and trusting in ways no eyes could capture. Ethan, broad-shouldered and rugged with green eyes softened by weeks of sleepless nights and constant vigilance, carried Zephyr carefully in his arms. The pup's tiny body was wrapped in a blanket, her fractured limbs healing, muscles still weak but slowly gaining strength. Her milky white eyes could not perceive the brilliance of the sun or the sparkle of snow, yet the warmth on her fur, the faint smell of pine, and the sound of Ethan's footsteps created an entirely new sensory map, a world waiting to be discovered. Setting her gently on the snow-covered ground, Ethan crouched nearby. Zephyr's small paws pressed tentatively against the cold surface. At first, she froze, tail tucked tightly, ears flicking in every direction, processing unfamiliar textures and sounds. She sniffed cautiously, tentative breaths puffing in tiny clouds. The scent of pine needles, the crisp smell of snow, and the faint warmth of sunlight were entirely new to her. "Zephyr, it's okay. Take your time," Ethan whispered, his voice a constant guide and reassurance. "I'm right here. Just follow my voice." The pup's head tilted, ears twitching toward the familiar cadence of his words. Slowly, she stepped forward, one paw, then another, wobbling but refusing to fall back. Each tentative step was monumental, the culmination of weeks of trust-building, guided movement, and careful instruction. The first few feet were halting, almost comical in their unsteadiness, yet Ethan's voice never wavered. He clapped softly, calling her name gently, creating a rhythm she could follow. Zephyr's movements became more confident with each step. She pressed her nose forward, feeling the uneven snow beneath her paws, mapping the world through touch, smell, and the vibrations of her own movement. Every stumble was met with Ethan's steady hand nearby, not carrying her completely, but providing subtle support and safety. After several minutes, Zephyr paused, sniffed the air, and twitched her tail for the first time in full view of the open world. It was a faint movement, almost imperceptible, yet Ethan's chest tightened with emotion. She had found joy. Not the sighted joy of color or light, but a profound, tactile recognition of life, warmth, and freedom. She wagged again, more deliberately, brushing her small body against the snow with enthusiasm. The next challenge was movement without Ethan carrying her. He called her softly, creating a path for her to follow. Step by step, Zephyr moved forward, wobbling, pressing paws carefully against the cold, until she reached Ethan, nudging his hand, panting in exhausted triumph. Her tiny body was trembling, not from fear, but from exertion and exhilaration. Ethan knelt, pressing her gently to his chest. "You did it. You really did it," he whispered. "You've made it into your world." Later that day, Ethan introduced Zephyr to the neighboring dogs she had only encountered in the clinic. A young Labrador named Finn, golden and exuberant, bounded through the snow, tail wagging, while a nimble border collie, Ivy, circled cautiously. Zephyr's initial reaction was hesitation, tail tucked and body low. Ethan spoke softly, guiding her to orient by scent and sound rather than sight. Step by step, the pup approached, nudging Finn with a tentative sniff, pressing her body into his warmth. Ivy's gentle taps encouraged her to play, and soon Zephyr was attempting small, clumsy movements, following playful nudges and vocal cues. She could not see, yet she felt the world around her participating fully in its rhythm. By mid-afternoon, Zephyr had discovered the boundaries of the backyard, guided by Ethan's voice and the subtle cues of the other dogs. She leapt over small mounds of snow, sniffed the base of trees, and bounded in small circles, tail wagging with a confidence previously unimaginable. Ethan watched, his chest tight with pride and awe. The pup had transformed from a fragile, abandoned bundle into a young dog experiencing joy, connection, and trust. Each sound, each scent, each touch of snow beneath her paws was a revelation. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold, Zephyr paused, sitting in the snow and lifting her head toward Ethan. Her blind eyes reflected nothing of the sunset's brilliance, yet the tilt of her head, the wag of her tail, the eager nudge toward his hand spoke volumes. She had chosen to trust, to explore, to embrace life despite the cruel hand fate had dealt her. Ethan knelt beside her, brushing the snow from her fur, whispering stories of the mountains, of winter nights and long-past storms. Zephyr pressed against him, panting softly, a tiny warmth radiating through his arms. He realized, in that quiet, snow-laden moment, that rescue had transformed them both. She had learned to navigate and trust, yet she had also healed parts of him, his own scars, his own loneliness, filled by the mutual devotion and resilience they had cultivated together. As darkness fell, Ethan scooped Zephyr into his arms once more, carrying her inside the warm house. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls, reflecting in the pup's milky eyes. Though she would never see the flames or the sunset, she felt the warmth, heard the crackle of fire, smelled the home, and, most importantly, knew she was safe, loved, and wanted. That night, as Ethan watched Zephyr curl beside him on a soft blanket, he whispered, "You're home now, forever." The pup nestled closer, pressing her head against his arm, her breaths deep and steady. Outside, snow continued to fall silently, blanketing the world in white, but inside, life, warmth, and trust had taken hold. Zephyr's journey from abandonment, injury, and blindness to joy, exploration, and love was complete for now. The young German Shepherd had learned that even a world once filled with cruelty could be mapped and understood through trust, care, and the guiding voice of someone who refused to let go. Winter in Frosthaven Ridge remained cold, relentless, and beautiful, but Zephyr had found her place in it. Every sound, every scent, every step was hers to claim, and through her journey, Ethan had learned the true meaning of resilience, patience, and unconditional love. In the pale glow of the snowy night, the pup rested peacefully, tail flicking occasionally, chest rising with the rhythm of life reclaimed. The storm outside could rage, but within this small home, light and warmth reigned supreme, and the future, though uncertain in some ways, brimmed with promise. In the story of Zephyr, we see how even the smallest, most fragile life can overcome darkness through trust, love, and care. It reminds us that miracles are real, and God's blessings can appear in the most unexpected forms, guiding us to protect, nurture, and love those in need. In our daily lives, we may encounter struggles or people who seem forgotten, but a little compassion, patience, and faith can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel to spread hope. May God bless each of you and guide your hearts toward kindness. Comment Amen if you believe in the power of faith and miracles.